This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay. My name's Thrush, and from the University of British Columbia. And let me start the way that my teachers have asked me to start, which is to say, Antha Thrush, Itsan at UBC, at Tatama Kwamathkuyam Siowenach, Itsan Setath Kwolstanuk, Tunawale. And that's in the language called Hunkaminam, which is the first language of Vancouver. It's the language, what I said to you is my name's Thrush, I'm from UBC, which rests on the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation, and I'll be your speaker today. And that's customary in my field of Indigenous studies now, is to acknowledge whose territory you work in, whose territory you're speaking on. And I'm never quite sure how to do that when I'm here in Britain. It's much easier when I'm in, say, Seattle or California or someplace like that to acknowledge traditional Indigenous territory. My ancestry is English, so I kind of feel like I'm in my own ancestral territory in a way. But certainly in the field, this is customary now for us to do this kind of acknowledgement, so I wanted to start there. What I'd like to do today is really talk you through very much a work in progress, a book that I'm currently in the middle of writing. I'm on my sabbatical year this year. It's under contract with Yale University Press. Expected 2017 publication date, and this is the year that I'm really trying to finish the writing. And so what I'd like to do is just really walk you through what I'm thinking about with this project, and I really am quite interested in what those of you who work on London history have to say about this. My goal is to really kind of bring a disorienting angle to the city's history by doing this work, but it's not, London history is not something that I'm trained in. British history is not something I'm trained in. I'm trained in Indigenous history, so this has been quite a steep learning curve for me. So what I'm quite interested in as a scholar is what I call the narrative estrangement of urban and Indigenous histories. And so this is the idea that Indigenous histories and urban histories are mutually exclusive. And I'll explain what I mean by Indigenous in a minute as well. And these are just some expressions of that from the United States. The color image there is a lithograph from 1872 that's called American Progress. And that's the spirit of progress drifting west across the plains, and she's trailing telegraph wire behind her. And you can kind of see the stages of American civilization. Native people running into the darkness ahead of her, and then the wagon trains and the plow and the railroad, and then in the distance, in the light of the rising sun, is the city. And this is the way American history is typically described and portrayed, as city at one end of the spectrum and Indigenous peoples at the other. You can also see that in the image on the left there, that's actually from a 19th century school book like the one that the Spirit of Progress is carrying. And it says an American Indian contemplating the progress of civilization. And it's very clear that he's outside of that progress. He's framed outside of that historical trajectory that's taking place in the distance. And the image on the lower right is from Seattle. It's a real estate brochure selling mud flats that would eventually become the industrial district of Seattle. And again, here you've got this idea of Indigenous people, sort of stock characters almost from Hollywood, kind of Pocahontas and Hiawatha, sitting outside the frame, observing history taking place. So what I was really interested in doing in my first book, based on my dissertation, was challenging this by looking at three different kinds of Native history in the city. One was the history of local Indigenous people in whose territory the city was built up, so the Duwamish people, like the two in the upper left there. The history of Native migration to the city from other places, so the lower image is an encampment of Indigenous people from northern British Columbia in the heart of the city around 1900. And then on the upper right, I was quite interested in the use of Native imagery in the city. So, for example, these are basically the Chamber of Commerce, city leaders dressed as totem poles walking down one of the main streets of Seattle as part of a festival. And that's very typical for Seattle to sell itself using Indigenous imagery. And so what I was arguing in this book is that instead of Indigenous and urban histories being mutually exclusive, they're actually mutually constitutive. They actually create each other. And so I moved to Vancouver in 2005. Mostly I show this just to show how beautiful Vancouver is. It's kind of a stunning place. I came to Vancouver to UBC in 2005, and when Native Seattle came out in 2007, a friend of mine who's from London jokingly said, well, great, you should write a book like that about London now. And I kind of laughed it off, but then within just a couple of minutes, I thought, what about taking this idea of orienting, of telling and reframing a city's history through Indigenous experience and pushing that to the center of empire? Would that actually be possible? And so that's what I'm engaged in now. What would it be like to think about a landscape like this as part of an indigenous world, as part of indigenous territory? And so that's what this project is about. And London has its own narratives of estrangement. This is a really great example of that. This is from the same year as the American Progress lithograph, Doré's The New Zealander. And in 1872, New Zealander means Maori. It doesn't mean Pākehā, it doesn't mean a white settler. It means an indigenous New Zealand person. That's what this is supposed to represent in the foreground here. This doesn't look like a Maori person at all, but that's who it's supposed to represent. And here he's surveying the ruins of London, the idea being here that by the time an indigenous person finally gets to London, it'll be in ruins. Again, the two are mutually exclusive, even if the narrative is kind of inverted. And so what the book is about is a history of London framed through the experiences of Indigenous people who came from territories that became Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. And these are just 4 examples. Louis Tewanima, who was a Hopi runner in the 1908 Olympics. Bennelong, who was an Eora man from what's now Sydney, who came to London in 1792. Hongi Hika, who was actually a Cambridge linguist while he was in Britain, but spent time in London as well in the 1820s. And then Dagayo Nwage, or Pauline Johnson, who was a poet and performer in the early 20th century. And I'm using the term indigenous in an explicitly kind of political context. There's kind of lowercase indigenous, meaning something that's native to the place that it comes from. And I'm using uppercase indigenous here, showing my own alliance with a modern day indigenous movement around the world. And I've chosen these 4 settler states because they are distinct in some ways within the British Empire. And it also makes it a doable project. It gives me some boundaries that make it manageable. And we can talk more about my definitions of indigenous and the problems with that term as well as the benefits of it. And when I first started working on this project, I thought I would be uncovering a hidden history of the city. And there's a long history, literary history of hidden cities within London, in both popular literature as well as reformist literature, going all the way back to people like Thomas de Quincey writing about the world of opium and prostitution, Henry Mayhew writing about the world of the urban poor, P.L. Travers with the chimney sweeps world at the top of London. Obviously Ian Sinclair's work, psychogeographical work, is quite concerned with this idea of hidden fugitive cities, and popular writers like Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, which many of my students will be familiar with. And when I started this project, I thought I would be uncovering a hidden history, a hidden city, and I've always been quite intrigued with that idea. But what I found very quickly is that I was wrong, that the people that I'm writing about were highly visible in their day. And the idea that it would be a hidden city is actually an artifact of that same narrative estrangement that I had actually kind of internalized myself. And this history of visibility goes back very early. So this is the first presence of Indigenous people from North America in London. This is from one of the chronicles of the 16th century. This year also were brought unto the king 3 men taken in the Newfound Island, that before I spoke of in William Purchas's time being mayor. These were clothed in beast skins and ate raw flesh, and spoke such speech that no man could understand them. And then their demeanor like to brute beasts, who the king kept a time after. Of which upon 2 years past after I saw 2 of them apparelled after Englishmen in Westminster Palace, which at that time I could not discern from Englishmen till I was learned what men they were, but as for speech I heard none of them utter one word. So just for context, this is 10 years after Columbus. This is extremely early. These people are probably Inuit, based on the description of raw flesh. But beyond that, we know nothing about them. This is all there is about them. There's no sense of how they got there. We know that one of them must have died because there were originally 3, then there are just 2, but we don't know anything about what happened to those 2 ultimately. For a time, I thought one of the chapters of the book might just be this quotation in the middle of a blank page, just to sort of present the reader with this is the reality of the archival record, not just for Indigenous people, but really, as many of you know, I'm sure, for this period generally. It's just so fragmentary. But as we get better and better sources, we get more and more visibility of Indigenous people and sources from them themselves. So these are three men, all Anishinaabe or Ojibwe men who came in the middle of the 19th century as performers and advocates for their people. And in all three cases, they kept their own record of their time in London in the form of diaries, journals, as well as published works. So we actually do have Indigenous perspectives on the city. And by and large, when we do have Indigenous perspectives on the city or perspectives attributed to them, there are two really common denominators, common commentaries on the city. The first has to do with its ecology, the quality of the air, water, the filth of the city, and so on. And the second has to do with a critique of class differences within the city. Across the board, Indigenous visitors are quite shocked at the difference between the rich and the poor in London. And that's a really consistent critique. The sense that we would never allow this to happen in our own communities. So what I thought I would do is just walk you relatively quickly through the structure of the book itself. And I've arranged it around what I'm calling domains of entanglement. And these are different kind of thematic ways in which London is entangled with Indigenous spaces, the ways in which these two kinds of history are really enmeshed with each other. And so each chapter looks at one of these things: knowledge, disorder, reason, recognition. This is the chapter I'm working on right now. I'm not entirely sure if that's what it's about. We'll see what happens. Discipline and memory. And when I say entanglement, what I'm looking at is the physicality of an entanglement as well. So this is just one example of that. This is an image that's quite well known in my field. It's portraying the first contact between an Inuit community in what's now the far Arctic north of Canada and the British at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's painted by a man called John Stackhouse, that's his English name. And he's an Inuit man, and this is generally perceived as an object of the Arctic. It portrays the Arctic, it's created by a man from the Arctic, but it was actually created here. It was created at the Greenland dock on the Thames in 1819. He lived aboard a ship there, gave kayak demonstrations for thousands of people. People could pay money to come on board the ship and look at him. They could also buy paintings and drawings from him, and he died aboard that ship. So is that object an object of the Arctic, or is it an object of London? The answer is yes. It's a product of both. And that's what I'm quite interested in, are these intermingled objects and spaces as well. So an example of a space are these two buildings, Oxford Street and Bishopsgate. The building on the left, I actually just noticed one day as I was walking down Oxford Street, I noticed these gargoyles on top of the building, and they're beavers. And this is quite an unusual subject for gargoyles in Britain, as you might guess. And the building is called the Hat Factory. It actually has those words carved into the side of it. And in the late 19th century, this is one of the premier places to buy top hats, which are, of course, made from beaver pelt, and when they're not made from silk. And I started thinking about this building and started working my way back from the hat to the pelt across the Atlantic, to the living beaver on the trap line of an Indigenous person, probably Cree or Dene during this period, and thinking really about how Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous labor, through the production of capital, actually makes this building possible. That it's actually an extension of Indigenous territoriality, really. The building on the right is on the side of a former Hudson's Bay Company office, and the weather vane is a beaver facing west. And so we can really think about these places not as necessarily the center, but as outliers in an Indigenous geography. So that's what I'm talking about, entanglement. That's what I'm getting at there. So let me just quickly walk you through the chapters. I want to leave time for questions. So you all know this city. You know how explosive it is during this period in terms of population growth. The thing that's interesting about England is that England is quite late in coming to the process of colonization compared to Spain, for example, and urban growth and the pressures of that are one of the leading rationalizations for colonization in the late 16th century. You really see that in the documents having to do with the creation of colonial ventures. And what I'm really interested in this period is the movement of a particular group of people to London, and these are all people from the Eastern Algonquian peoples. So this map is tilted. There's Nova Scotia on the left and North Carolina on the right. And these are people who came sometimes willingly, sometimes as captives from these peoples in the late 16th and early 17th century. And what I've done is I've tracked them into the city, looked at who they were staying with, who they were affiliated with, and it's really clear that these people were deeply involved in the production of knowledge about what would become colonies in the sort of expanding English, what we might eventually call an empire. And these people are sort of they're not necessarily the results of colonization. Their presence in the city is coeval with it. It's happening at the same time. One example, again, of the entangledness of this has to do with this period, and it's this document in the lower, in the center here. And this is an alphabet that was created for the Roanoke language of Osamokomok. That's the name of the territory of the Roanoke people in what's now North Carolina. This was created by Thomas Harriot. And one of the things that I've been arguing is that it was actually co-created by him and 2, possibly 3 Roanoke men who were brought back to London in the 1580s. And in fact, I finally had a chance to look at this document, the original at the Westminster School, and it actually, if I'm correct, it actually has the signature of one of these men at the bottom of it, which would be the first example of alphabetic literacy by an indigenous person north of Mexico. It actually says Manteo did this, and one of the men was named Manteo. So that was quite exciting to find that, obviously. And the document was produced not in Osamokomok, but in Sir Walter Raleigh's house on the Thames at Durham House. And so again, it's one of these beautifully entangled objects. And it really gives a sense of how indigenous presence is shaping knowledge about what would become a colony, and in this case, a lost colony. Pocahontas is probably the most famous. She's also known as Rebecca Rawle from Mataoaka. She's probably the most famous, the most well-known person during this period, and her presence in the city really shaped public opinion by all the records we have about colonization. Her presence at a Twelfth Night celebration at the court of James VI really seems to have shaped public opinion. There was a lot of criticism of the Virginia Company prior to her arrival in the city, and there seems to have been a lot more support of it after her presence, and she actually dies in the city as well. And as part of this chapter, I do also try to follow these people out and see what actually happened to them. And the idea behind bringing most of these people was to turn them into helpmates of colonization, as translators and as informants. And in only 2 cases did that actually happen. Those are the 2 green ones here. Tisquantum is Squanto. You may know him from the American Thanksgiving myth, the man who helps the pilgrims. But many of the others did not participate in colonization as willing participants. The ones in red actually took up arms and led resistance against colonists. Others simply returned and we don't know what happened to them. The orange ones are the ones I'm quite intrigued by. These are the ones that we have no idea what happened to them at all, which means they probably, like the people in white, actually died in London. That's probably the outcome for them. And this is an outcome for many of the people I'm writing about in this book. The second chapter jumps forward quite a bit. There's a long period in which no indigenous travelers that we have records of come to London for a host of reasons we could talk about. In the early 18th century, I'm quite interested in a series of political delegations that come. So these are not captives. These are people who are coming very much willingly to set up economic, military, religious alliances with the British Crown. The most famous of these are the so-called Four Kings. These are 3 Mohawk and 1 Mohican men who come from what is the most powerful polity in northeastern North America during this period, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy. And again, they come to set up these alliances. And what I'm interested in with these delegations are the ways in which narratives of urban disorder get layered onto them. And in this case, there's a lot of discourse around them that has to do with class disorder in the city and the potential for class-based violence. So, for example, they're taken to see Macbeth at the Royal Theatre in Drury Lane, and there's a riot in the theatre because the audience doesn't want to see Macbeth, the audience wants to see them. And they threaten to burn the place down. It's described as kind of the typical rabble and mob. They threaten to burn the theater down, and the owner decides the strategy will be to put 4 chairs on the stage so the audience can watch these men watching Macbeth. So we get these layers of observation. There's also an outbreak of gang violence just after this period, and one of the gangs that is most written about, may or may not have existed, call themselves the Mohawks. And so there's a sense of urban savagery being linked to ideas about indigenous savagery, and they're being tangled up together. Discourses about gender also get linked to these delegations, particularly this one. These are people from what's now Savannah, Georgia. And in particular, discussions of this group focus on the one woman, the person in pink there. Her name is Sanaki. And there's a lot of discussion of her in comparison to British women, and particularly the women of London. She's seen as superior to them because she's chaste, she doesn't swear, she's not licentious, she doesn't seem to be stepping outside her bounds, and this is a period of intense change around gender roles, and there's a lot of debate, as I'm sure you know, about the status of women in London, and you can see that being layered onto her. And she was actually probably the most powerful person in the delegation. It's a matriarchal society, even though her role in many ways was kind of silenced. And then I'm quite interested with these delegations as well, with narratives having to do with alcohol, and that those come through very strongly in all of these delegations, but it doesn't have to do with indigenous drinking. It has to do with the drinking of people associated with the delegations, and in particular translators. So the translator for this delegation is the man on the left, sort of the zombie-looking figure there, who actually dies of alcoholism during this group's visitation to London. So it's coming right at the end of a war. These are incredibly high-stakes negotiations between the Cherokee and the English. The English representatives don't speak Cherokee, the Cherokee don't speak English, and then the translator dies. And that happens with a couple of these delegations as well. And it's happening right in the midst of the gin craze that we all know about. And those narratives come together in these moments in really interesting ways. And these three issues, tension between classes, status of women, and alcohol, are all very much at play in indigenous territories as well, in ways that we can talk about more. These three men, keep them in mind because you'll see them again. You've actually already seen them once. I jump ahead to reason, to the question of reason in the late 18th century. And here I really try to talk about the city of the Enlightenment, and really play with this idea of the tension between the enlightened European mind and the so-called unenlightened primitive mind. And what's really typical in portrayals of these indigenous travelers, like these three men who are the focus of the chapter, the idea that indigenous people simply cannot understand the city. Their minds are simply not equipped to take in the enormity and the complexity and the sophistication of London. And you actually see that sometimes in their own accounts. Samson Occam is the first person. He's a Protestant minister. He's the first person for whom we have his own account of the city. And he talks about it as being such confusion as I never dreamt, and there's no way I can understand this city. And that same idea is attributed to both of these other men as well. And so what I'm trying to do, though, is set that alongside the narratives of other visitors to the city from elsewhere. So people like Casanova or Karl Moritz, who say very similar things about the city. It's completely overwhelming, it's beyond our ken, we have no framework for making sense of this place. And in fact, this is the way that Londoners talk about the city as well. So the primitive mind is not the issue here, the issue is the city itself. That's the anomaly here. And in fact, indigenous visitors during this period, as I said earlier, have critiques of the city, particularly its ecology and its class structure, including those three men that I just showed you. Moving ahead to the chapter I'm working on right now, again, I'm not sure what this one is about entirely. I'm still figuring that out. For a while, I thought it was about protocol, then I thought and ritual, then I thought it was about empathy, and a friend pointed out to me that the place where those two things come together is the question of recognition, both in human recognition as well as political recognition. So I think that's what this is about. The focus is groups of people that don't show up earlier in the book. And these are people from the Pacific, so Kanaka Maoli, or native Hawaiian people, and then Maori people from what's New Zealand now. And these range quite broadly in terms of the kinds of people that are traveling. You have the king and queen of Hawaii who come in 1824, and they actually die here. They lay in state first at the old Adelphi near the Strand, and then they also lay in state at St. Martin in the Fields. I do these walking tours of Indigenous London, and it's quite something to be standing in Trafalgar Square and describe the funeral situation taking place in St. Martin in the Fields with feathered cloaks and all these sorts of things. It's quite disorienting to people in a way that I think is really useful. On the lower range of images there, the Pomare family are brought as symbols of the potential for Maori people to be civilized. And they're quite famous in their day. But there are also Maori and Hawaiian sailors who are coming into the east end of the city, into the docks, and political and military leaders like this man Tafiao. And they're coming during times of war between the British and their own people. And so I'm quite interested in the ways in which the ability of these people to engage the rituals of the city are related to what's going on in their own territories in relationships with the British. Just to give you a sort of an anecdote, since I'm still figuring out this chapter, Lot Kapuaiwa is the king of, he's Kamehameha V, he's king of Hawaii. He comes to London with his younger brother as a teenager and keeps his own, they both keep their own diaries, and they're taken to the British Museum, and they're shown Hawaiian materials that were brought back by Captain Cook, including this ahu'ula, which is a shoulder-to-floor length cloak made out of feathers. That is a sort of royal object. And it's interesting in their journals, according to the discourses that you hear about museums and Indigenous peoples today, we might expect that they would want these objects back. They would want them back in Hawaii. But in fact, what they say is, we saw the Egyptians, we saw the Greeks, we saw the Romans, we saw these great civilizations. We're one of those too, and we want our things in this museum alongside these other great peoples. So it's quite a different narrative than we might expect. And then they're taken to Greenwich Naval Hospital, and they're shown all the great paintings of military victories and so on. And they're shown the death of Captain Cook. And they say, both of them say in their journals, we saw all kinds of art in the city, but the piece that we liked the best was the death of Captain Cook, who was, of course, killed by their own people in the 18th century at a place called Kealakekua. So I think there's some interesting kind of resistance narratives going on in some of these. Just to keep moving forward, and each chapter is a little faster here, I pick up the idea of discipline, and here I'm quite interested in the Victorian and late Victorian and Edwardian city, the suburban city, and there's a lot of discourse in the city during this period, the height of empire, about suburban bodies, and about suburban bodies not necessarily being fit to rule an empire, becoming soft. Everyone is becoming accountants and clerks and so on. And one of the answers to this problem that you hear from headmasters, from ministers, from all kinds of social theorists during the time is sport. So things like cricket and rugby and so on. And so what I'm interested in this chapter are a series of Indigenous athletic performances that take place in the city. I never thought in a million years I would be writing about sports, but sometimes your research takes you in places you never thought you'd go. So Hatkosodone, who is a Seneca runner, Aboriginal cricketers from the state of Victoria in Australia, a mostly Maori rugby team. These are the precursors to the All Blacks, who some of you will be familiar with today. And then Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Most of those performers were Lakota from the American Plains. And in all of these cases, there are really strong discussions about racial fitness. These are highly Darwinistic discussions that are taking place, and it's very much about the disciplining of bodies, at the same time that Indigenous bodies are being disciplined in their own territories through things like residential and boarding schools, the introduction of wage labor in the 7-day week, and so on. So there's this again, an entanglement having to do with bodily disciplines. And there's quite a lot of anxiety when these people win. This gets right back to that question of imperial fitness. Particularly the Aboriginal cricketers, Aboriginal people at this period are seen as absolutely the lowest rung of humanity. And when they actually win against British teams, it's quite a shock to people. And you can also see in the image of Hatkosodone there how much bigger he is than the British runner, and this is a constant narrative in descriptions of him too, is that he's just a bigger man than his British counterparts, and that has all kinds of implications. The last chapter of the book is about memory, and this is about the memory of these travelers in descendant communities today. It involves a lot of interviews and so on. Just to give you a couple of quick examples, this is the grave of a man named Pripamyaraman, who was one of the Aboriginal cricketers. He died of pneumonia in 1868 when they were here. And he was buried in what's now called Meath Gardens. It was one of the Victorian garden cemeteries. He's the only grave that's still marked there. There's a little plaque and then a gum tree. And this is actually kept up by the Aboriginal Australian Cricket Association. When Aboriginal cricketers and other Aboriginal travelers come to Britain, it's quite common for them to do some ceremony here to commemorate him and keep him connected with their own community. This I just saw yesterday on a walking tour that I was taking. This is at Southwark Cathedral. This is a monument to a Mohegan man from what's now Connecticut who came in 1736 to present a petition to the Queen, or to the King, sorry, having to do with land rights as settlers were encroaching on their territory. He died of smallpox before he could present that petition and was buried at Southwark. In 2006, his tribe, his people, unveiled this monument to commemorate him, and in fact, they didn't unveil it, the Queen unveiled it. So these are quite high-level diplomatic things that are still at work, and they presented him with her with a petition that he had not been able to in the 1730s to kind of complete that symbolic act. And I've interviewed both of these guys, both Mark and Bruce, and they talked about going into Southwark Cathedral drumming and singing the honor songs that had not been sung for Mahomet all those 260 years earlier, and how powerful that was for them, that they felt like those 270 years actually had collapsed in this really powerful ancestral connection. It's not just about ancestral connections, though. It can also be about politics. So these are the three Cherokee guys with the zombie interpreter drunk guy. These are the three of them reinterpreted by a Cherokee artist. This will be the cover of the book, actually. And obviously it's a riff on Abbey Road. And in 2012, 250 years after that delegation, the three Cherokee nations sent a delegation to kind of follow in their footsteps. And again, create that kind of ancestral connection, but they were also doing political lobbying around a law in the US called the Violence Against Women Act that was going to be exempting reservation lands from the bill, which would have really negatively impacted women's safety. And so they were actually arguing with members of parliament and so on to put pressure on the American government. So this is actually about present-day politics as well. It's not just about ancestral spiritual connections. And then of these communities that I'm writing about, none of them have produced diasporic communities in London. It's not like you go to Brick Lane and that's where you get really great Cherokee food, for example, right? These communities, for a host of reasons, have not produced diasporic communities here, with one exception, and that's the Maori. There are several hundred Maori at any time living in London. Many of them are on 2-year work visas as young people. And they have created an organization called Ngati Ranana. Ngati is tribe, Ranana is London in the Maori language. And they have created a really strong sense of community here. And in fact, for many young people of Maori ancestry, they become more Maori when they're here almost, through building this community. And that's what I hear again and again from people that I've talked to, which is an interesting, ironic kind of thing. Just the images here, the lower right, that's a Maori waka or canoe coming up the Thames. I think it's a really wonderful image. This is waiata. This is singing being done at a church here in the city. Just a gathering. And then in the upper left there, this is an ancestral meeting house called Hinamihi, and she's actually considered an ancestor by the Maori people. She was taken from her traditional location in New Zealand and put up in a garden here in London as a decoration. And she's been reclaimed by the Maori community now as their sort of ceremonial center. Their marae is the term, and have festivals there now and take care of her as an ancestor and consider her now properly here. She belongs here in a way. There's a new Hinamihi that exists where she used to be, and they're both considered the same being, but in two really different places now. So what this does is it really gives lie to this image. it really challenges this and shows that this is actually completely a false image. This is 1872. By that point, Indigenous people from New Zealand had already been traveling to London for over 60 years. And obviously, Maori people have arrived long before the city is in ruins and are creating community here today. So just to end, obviously, I hope you get a sense as I'm talking about this that I'm very interested in Indigenous agency. I don't want to create a sense of colonialism that produces only Indigenous victimhood. So I'm interested in questions of resistance, Indigenous people coming for their own reasons, and so on. But one of the biggest challenges, I would say, in my field is finding the right balance between agency and the bigger structures of colonialism. If we overstate the power of colonialism and the power of empire, as I said, then all we get is victimhood. But if we overstate agency, then it doesn't sound like colonialism hurt very much. And so trying to find the balance between those two things is quite challenging. And the place where I go to sort of literally physically go to meditate on this question and really think about this is this place, St. Olaf, Hart Street, quite close to the tower. In 1577, an English explorer named Martin Frobisher went to what's now Baffin Island and captured 3 individuals, a man, a woman, and her baby. You can see them here. The baby is in her parka. You can see his face there next to hers. We don't know their names. The woman was called Arnoch, which just means woman in Inuktitut, the Inuit language. Nutak comes from Nutarak, which just means baby. She and the man died almost immediately upon arrival in Britain. The baby was brought to London and put on display in a tavern, and the idea was to get him into the arms of Elizabeth as kind of a symbolic adoption of the Americas, really. You can imagine the symbolic import of a moment like that. But he died first and was buried at St. Olaf, Hart Street. That's all we know about him. And in my own thinking and in the introduction to the book, I really cast him against Samuel Pepys, who's also buried there. This was his parish church. And as we all know, we know everything. We know way more than we want to know about Samuel Pepys, right? He's kind of the king of too much information in a lot of ways. And I'm quite interested in the differential archival weights of these 2 individuals. That's the nature of colonialism, right? That we know so much about one and not so much about the other. But these things are ongoing as well. Last summer, I met this artist, Peter Moran, who's now a good friend. He's Tahltan from British Columbia. He's a performance artist, and he was doing interventions in the urban landscape of London related to Indigenous questions. So, for example, he would put on his regalia, go to the gates of Buckingham Palace, lay down and sing traditional songs. He also did a mourning ceremony in Gravesend at the site where Pocahontas is buried, and things like this. And we met, and he asked me about other sites to do these kinds of interventions, and I told him about St. Olaf, Hart Street, and he said, absolutely, we should do some ceremony there. So last fall, we made plans to do some ceremony, and my role was going to be to tell the boy's story, and then he would lead the actual ritual. So the day before, he went to the church to speak with the verger, just to let him know that we would be doing this. And the verger said to him, you will not drum, you will not sing, you will not speak. If you do any ritual, it'll be in your head because, quote, you're in England now. And what you're doing has no place here. And when I heard this the next day when we met up, I was so angry about this. At the same time that I thought, I'm going to be writing about this. This completely makes my point. The sense that Indigenous stuff doesn't belong in cities at all. So we did do ceremony. We left some things behind that the verger may or may not find. And I won't go into any details about it. We did it silently, though. We were forced to. And so for me, that really brings it all back. Here we are 400 years later, plus, still engaging in these questions about who belongs where, who gets to speak, who has voice, who has the archival heft, and so on. So this is the place where I go to really think about these things and to try to get the balance of that right. And it's something that I have a piece that just came out in the Journal of British Studies that's about an Inuit family in the 1770s, where I'm trying to get that balance right as well. It's one of the most challenging pieces about this work. So I think that's all I've got in terms of presentation for today. But I'm really interested in what kinds of questions you might have, particularly those of you who work on London. Again, I was trained in the 19th, 20th century American West, so this is all, this has been a very steep learning curve for me. So I'm really curious what you all think.
Right. Thank you very much, Colm.
Yeah.
And as you said, if there are any questions, I've got plenty, but since I'm chair, I think it's only fair that I leave mine until you've asked your fill.
Sure.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah.
So I'm a 19th century historian of London.
Yes.
So that's a good start, isn't it?
Yeah.
So my research area is missionary work in London. Missions are a really good way to access portrayals of foreigners.
Yes.
So I'm giving a paper next week in Oxford on the London City Mission's mission to the foreigner.
Yes.
So obviously they want to make everybody Christian.
Yeah. The strangers' homes
And I'm pretty
things.
certain, though mine's just a general paper, that I've come across reference to Maoris.
Yes. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Yeah. I think something you might want to think about in the later period is the exhibition of the foreigner.
Yeah.
So there's lots of this Salon exhibition or Empire exhibition where foreigners are put on display.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So there might be some really interesting material there.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the few things, when I talk about this project, there are two things that people will say that they've heard of. One is Pocahontas, and the other is, oh, they brought people here and put them on display, right? And what's interesting is that explicit sort of ethnographic, zoo-like display of people doesn't happen quite as often as we might expect. There are some quite well-known examples of that, and certainly these people are always, if we go back to that Macbeth moment, they're always on display in some way. So I struggle with how much I want to emphasize that, because it's kind of the expected story, but absolutely these people are, in some cases they're being put on display, but in other cases it's really clear they're putting themselves on display for particular, often political reasons.
In the London City missionaries, they have about 380 missionaries in London. They're the biggest missionary organisation.
Yeah.
And about 15 are assigned to foreigners with particular foreign categories, depending on their language skills. And they really enjoy their engagement with the people who are exhibited, say Amazonian warriors, because they can learn language skills.
That's right.
But they're very keen to give them Christian tracts to take away.
That's right. Yeah, the chapter I'm working on right now, the Maori and Hawaiian chapter, that's a very strong piece of it. A lot of the young men that are being brought, Maori men, are living with missionaries. There are these tracts that are produced about them, not just for them, but about them as well. And so for me, that fits into this question of empathy. Because it really militates against this idea of the savage other. There's something much more complicated, I would say, going on there than just this imperial othering along racial hierarchies, what we might call racial hierarchies. There's something far more complicated going on that's happening in places like Salisbury Square, or Edgware Road, and these spaces in the city, as well as the West India Docks and so on. So.
And you get a real sense that the missionaries have a duty of care to the foreigners. So they live in prison, in the hospital, they translate for them in court.
That's right. Yeah. Which again really works against this top-down empire, right? And that's what I want to mess with. Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yeah. I'm just extremely sympathetic to your the issue that you mentioned you were having about sort of the balance between agency and imperial power, and the reason why I'm sort of like struggling with the same idea is that, well, I'm a historian of modern South Asia, and I'm working on the global dimension of the Indian princely states, and one of the things that I'm looking at, and I've just written a PhD chapter on this, is the travel of Indian rulers to Europe and to London in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I just feel that the presence of these sort of peoples from all over the world to London is sometimes phrased very much in terms of display, as you were just saying.
Yeah.
They were brought here to represent the might and the spread of the British Empire and whatnot. But there's also more sort of everyday, mundane stories to be told here about how they dressed, what they ate, who they interacted with. So I was wondering if you could say something more about perhaps this more little stories of resistance, if you think that's what it is, and also about if there's a class dimension to this, because are those people that are being brought over perceived to be leaders of their societies, and then how do they interact with high sort of upper class British society? How does the class dimension come in?
Yeah, certainly. I would say throughout, most of the people who come are actually high-class people, whether it's Pocahontas or the Four Kings or the Cherokee leaders and so on. Even the man who wrote Manteo did this on the document. These are all people who are elites. There are a few cases where that's not the case, and in fact those people tend to have real trouble when they go back home because they often are trying to use their experience in London to increase their own social status when they get home, and that often doesn't work very well and causes conflict and in some cases violence. So absolutely the class piece is at work, and I think too the point you make about mundane, sort of quotidian, everyday encounters, I think there's so much more going on in those. One I was just writing about today was this Maori man named Nahiti who comes in the 1830s, and he's an upper class man, and there's this moment where he's getting ready to return, and the New Zealand company is having a big sort of party, a big going away party, and there's quite detailed descriptions of the toasts that are going on, and he's toasting people as well. He's performing his own waiata, his own song, and so on. So there's a lot more going on there. At the same time, the idea is he's going to lead the Christianization and so on of the Maori people. But one of the impetuses for that is to protect the Maori from other settlers, particularly convicts from Australia and whalers and sailors. So it goes back to that same philanthropic kind of mission. So those are the things I'm trying to untangle in this chapter, that I'm working on, where you can see people engaging in everyday rituals with each other that are producing political as well as personal relationships. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Just really, you know, you were saying about the London tribe that almost become more indigenous in London.
Yeah.
I find that just quite, like, I've got an Irish friend who said he never drank Guinness.
Yeah.
And I work a bit on like the concept of identity and stuff like that, and it's interesting that if people come to a different land that is maybe quite a culture shock, they cling to
yes.
one thing. If they disapprove so much of class, like that massive class and all the other problems in London, I wonder, do you find that happens a lot with people who maybe were more inclined to resistance in that kind of way, like they saw London and kind of...
Yeah. Became more Cherokee. Yeah, I mean that's again one of the things where we do have the sources that people go home often aware of the necessity for alliances with the British because of the obvious power that's represented by the city, but also again with quite strident critiques that there are certain things that we don't want. We certainly don't want to become like these people. We may need them for our own military purposes or whatever. In terms of the Maori case today in Ngati Ranana, what I'm hearing from people that I talk to is that in particular one of the resources for creating that sense of Maori identity is just right next door, the British Museum, and the taonga that are there. Taonga is a Maori term, often gets translated as object, but it really means being. And so the Maori community here, some of the leaders in the community have created relationships with the British Museum to allow people to have some time alone with the objects that are there, with the taonga that are there, which creates a sense of Maori identity. And people then take that home with them. So it's not quite the Guinness thing. It's maybe deeper than that, but a similar dynamic for sure. Yeah.
Okay. my turn. I'm actually a historian of later medieval Wales.
Yes.
So to say that colonialism comes late to the English is not the point of view.
Yes.
We'll go down
Right.
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 If the English colonialism begins at home.
That's right.
So in Wales and Scotland and Ireland.
That's right.
And in France.
That's right.
There are English colonies throughout France from the fall of Calais in 1347.
Yeah.
When it's an English town in France till it falls to the French in 1558. But that is colonisation of a particular sort of socio-economic demographic sort of space, which is kind of familiar.
Mm-hmm.
But to talk about the Welsh, as I'm afraid it's my default setting, those of you who haven't met me. I'm not Welsh, but that's beside the point. It would be very strange for me to go to do a paper in Cardiff or Swansea and say, Croeso Balb, Adam Chapman, do we? To introduce myself. That would be deemed very odd.
Yes.
So there's a sort of I'm trying to frame the question around this. There is sort of a dissonance in the way in which discussions of colonialism in other periods and in other contexts are thought about and talked about. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's where it gets really complicated, is this definition of indigeneity. I teach a course on global Indigenous histories. It's a first-year course for very new students to the university, and one of the challenges of the course, we start with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has no definition of indigeneity in it. It's sort of about self-identification, and it's about historical experience. And of course once you really start to open that up, then what about the Welsh? What about Gaelic-speaking people in Scotland? Where does that stop? So it's a quite imprecise category. For me, I've tried to really bound it in terms of early modern and modern European forms of colonialism, particularly in places outside of Europe. Yeah. And that's kind of the sloppy working definition that I have.
The kind of sloppy working definitions we all have.
That's right. Yeah. And for me, my default position is just to say I needed to make it doable. So I'm going to choose these 4 places. Oh, absolutely. Sir Walter Raleigh is bringing back people from Trinidad and Guyana, but I'm not. They're in a footnote. Yeah. There's the very famous case of a woman named Sarah Bartman, who in her day was called the Hottentot Venus. And she was put on display in quite horrific ways. So one of the most extreme examples of that, at the beginning of the 19th century, she's from South Africa. Again, she's in there, but not as an emphasis. So it's, in a way, the way I use Indigenous is also to, again, signal my connection to and sympathies with a modern political movement. Yeah. That I see myself as being part of, political as well as intellectual and theoretical movement. So, and I realize that's presentist, but
that's what we're historians. It's what we do.
That's right. That's right.
So one little follow-up point. Yeah. But 2 16th century examples. Again, from a Welsh context, Wales is not an urban country.
No.
Still isn't.
No.
Cardiff and Swansea are aberrations.
Yeah.
But you go to Carnarvon. The far northwest corner of Wales, founded by Edward I as a colony, and it's still an English-identified space right into the end of the Middle Ages. Yeah. So Shire Hall Street, as it's called in English, has a rather different name in Welsh, and the name in Welsh is Stryd y Jail, Jail Street.
Jail Street.
So the 2 interactions of the 2 communities, based on language, perceive that street in different ways.
That's
One
right.
is the centre of county administration and law. For the other, it's the place you get sent to prison.
That's right. Which are the same thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a particularly favourite example of mine.
Yeah.
But, the other is another 16, and that's post Acts of Union, Carnarvonshire becoming a shire. So that is a 16th century, 17th century label which has stuck. But only since they started putting the street signs up bilingually.
Yes.
Is that been formalised? Right. So there's an interesting process there. The other one is an example of a diaspora in London, Welsh diaspora in London. It comes from Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1. And there's only one scene of a Welshman in it. It's a rather sort of bombastic thing of Glendora. And the last direction in that scene is the lady sings in Welsh. And that's actually in the first folio. I didn't believe this, but so there is a sense, there is a diaspora in the audience that
Yes.
would be expected to understand the language
That's
being
right.
sung, and there's someone in Shakespeare's company who can sing.
Or at least be able to recognize this is Welsh being
Yeah,
sung.
absolutely.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Which is
Well, in Shakespeare, you actually see Indigenous people. I mean, it's quite clear that Caliban, obviously is referencing the Indigenous Americas, if nothing else. There are references to dead Indians, people paying money to see dead Indians when they wouldn't give any money to a beggar, and so on. And these have been written about, but almost entirely in symbolic ways, that these are metaphorical people. And what I'm trying to do is really say, but no, these are linked to the people that are actually in the city. They will have actual reference for these things, just as you're saying about this Welsh piece of this play, that there's a context for that that's about social experience. It's not just about metaphor. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I was wondering about the sort of volume. You mentioned specific individuals for the purpose of your talk, but I was particularly in the 19th century. I was wondering the extent of the volume of this.
Like how many?
Yeah. In very general terms. Because I mean, for instance, there was quite I think I might say, there was quite a large Chinese community in sort of Limehouse.
Yeah.
In the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking, what extent, this was fairly common, to what extent you are just talking about the odd few.
And I was going to ask that question as well, because I wondered if there are any figures in the census. Because I've spent the week tabulating the foreigners in London, but the tables I've been looking at, because they're the big birthplace section of the census, they don't include colonial people. But I would bring myself to find that section.
Yeah, I've done that kind of census work before. It's not fun. Luckily, the people I'm writing about almost never will show up in a census because they're here quite often for quite short periods of time, and they're coming often as individuals or small groups. These are never large waves of people. And in fact, the first 3 times I applied for a grant for this, I was told this is an insignificant project because these people are numerically insignificant, which I think is an interesting position to take, and ultimately I prevailed. But these are small numbers, but what I find quite interesting is that they are given far more attention than their numbers would suggest. They're so highly visible, unlike people who are often kind of in the outskirts, the poor areas of the city, who are often ignored by people in power. That's what's interesting about these people, is you can actually kind of track where political power and social power are in the city by tracking these people, because that's who they end up connected to in almost all cases, with a few exceptions. And so it's a very different story than the story of immigrant groups. It's really quite different. So, yes.
This isn't really an academic question, but if we were to come on one of your London walks, presumably we would see where they stayed, and if they died here, where they were buried. But what else is there to see?
Well, the tour that I was giving in the fall as part of an Indigenous Cultures Festival, we went from Covent Garden to Westminster Abbey via Trafalgar Square and the Strand, and you took the tour. Yeah. So it was talking about where they lived while they were here, where they did political work, where things like the Mohawk gang ran around Covent Garden. So the ideas about these people as they're manifested in the landscape of the city, looking at how Indigenous people might have perceived it, or did perceive a place like Westminster Abbey. So it's, and I brought along quotations and images of these people, because one of the challenges is that there's not a lot to see until you really reframe the story. The irony of this, though, is, when I was writing Native Seattle and after it came out, I was doing a lot of walking tours in Seattle as well, where there's also nothing to see, because the Indigenous landscape has been so destroyed that actually once you reframe London as an Indigenous space, there's all kinds of things to see. Those columns at the front of the National Gallery, those used to belong to Carlton House. One of the people I'm writing about, he walked between those columns the guy on the right there, the Mohawk leader, he walked between those columns because he was a guest in that house. So to talk about that in Trafalgar Square, suddenly it reorients things, and it is an academic question, I think. It's about spatializing things in a really different way. So creating another, I'm quite a fan of the term palimpsest, and this creates another layer in the city that at first seems ephemeral, but I think can go to the heart of what is the nature of power in the city. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering if most of the people that you've been looking at are on a sort of return ticket to London, so to speak, or if they also travel to other places in England or Europe, or is it like East London seem to be as the only sort of worthwhile?
London is dominant, for sure. With the Industrial Revolution, people are increasingly taken to places like Sheffield to see the wonders of the Industrial Revolution. And I don't look at that much because I'm really trying to focus on the city as a space. But I'm trying to imagine what an Indigenous traveler would make of a place like Stoke-on-Trent, in the 1870s or something. I can't imagine. And the athletes that I write about, they did tours around Britain and Ireland in most cases too. But I have to be really careful that I not get spread out into that, and I always try to come back to the spaces of the city, the suburban spaces in that case, for example. But yeah, increasingly in the Victorian period, they start seeing lots of other places, and they often come through places like Plymouth or Bristol. That's where they actually arrive. They don't always come up the Thames. So, yeah. I try to push that to the footnotes.
And if aristocrats brought them to London, they would have had the country seats.
Yes, that's right.
He would have brought Omai to his country seat.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Omai was a Tahitian man who was brought in the 1770s. And and so in the case where these people do have country seats, they would have been taken there as well. Yeah.
There's a stately home in Surrey, I think it's in Guildford, which has a Maori hut.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's the one,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's an example where London starts to bleed out a little bit into the suburbs. Into the countryside. Yeah, but that community is really based in London. Yeah. That's Hinamihi. That's the one I was talking about. Yeah. So now instead of a hut, she's an ancestor. Yeah, she's a she instead of an it.
That personification of dwelling is. I'm quite glad I spent all that time drinking with archaeologists when I was doing my PhD. It didn't come as such a shock to me. It's not the kind of conversation British historians generally engage with.
No.
Because they tend to leave that stuff to the archaeologists and the anthropologists.
Yeah.
And I think this talk has been a very valuable sort of corrective to that.
Good.
And then, are there any final questions? No. In which case, let's just thank the speaker in the usual way. Thank you.
Thank you.